Thank you, Kristen, for that lovely introduction. I think I'm going to start. I have a lot to cover today, although, of course, possibly I've cut it so much that maybe it won't be so much, but I think I have a lot to cover. So I'm going to start with just a short introduction. I think I want to lead you from the idea of Oscar Wilde tours to the MFA. And then afterwards, I'm going to try to answer, I've been asked a number of different questions about my tour of the MFA, and I'm going to try to answer one of them, and in that answer to include answers to them all. We'll see how well I do with that. Oscar Wilde Tours was founded about 3 or 4 years ago, and it was actually founded initially to give gay history tours in Europe. I guess that's just what occurred to me first. I think I thought that it would be good to give a tour that followed Oscar Wilde's life from Dublin to London to Paris. And it occurred to me that a nice frame for that would be to include other issues in gay history that we might come upon in London and Paris. Because it seemed to me, first of all, that London and Paris are both, like New York, very important to gay history, and that also gay history is an important theme in the history of each of those cities. So I took a little trip over to London to do some exploration, and while I was there, it came to my mind that there were some things in the National Portrait Gallery that might fit into the tour. And I just thought, well, maybe I'll go take a look and see what I could find. And I think earlier this evening I said, so I will repeat, that I found God's gayest half-acre. I went through the door and was amazed. At that, the National Portrait Gallery, rather like the MFA, is a very active museum. Things move around constantly. Things are on loan, new things come up from the cellars. And, but at that time, the first or second statue that you saw on your right as you went into the permanent collection was King Edward II. One of the, I'll use the word gay loosely in historical terms, but one of the gayest seeming kings in England's history, whom people mostly know, I think, from Christopher Marlowe's play, Edward II, where he is definitely presented as what we would call gay. And so then you went through the museum. There were all kinds of things, ranging from the most famous portrait of Shakespeare, whose sexuality is certainly an interesting topic, and a wonderful 18th century French diplomat and spy in London who, at a certain point, started to dress as a woman. And the story just goes on from there, getting more and more complicated. He was eventually ordered to dress as a woman by King Louis XVI. It's an amazing story. Anyway, all kinds of things. And then the last thing you saw as you left was Ian McKellen on your left. And so I started giving a lecture, actually, in America, called The World's Gayest National Portrait Gallery, from King Edward II to Ian McKellen. So anyway, what happened was that museums started to become ever more central to my tours at that moment. Similarly, in Paris, the Louvre is an extremely, is full of things of relevance to gay history, from its Greek vases, which are fairly famous, up to quite a collection of homoerotica from the Napoleonic period, which is not so famous. In fact, I think that I probably discovered it. I don't think anyone's ever remarked on it, but it's really quite interesting, since that is the time, the first period in any modern Western country where same-sex relations were not criminalized. So it's quite interesting that it starts to appear in the arts in semi-masked ways. Anyway, so the National Portrait Gallery, the Louvre. About a year later, I decided to start giving a series of gay history tours of New York. And it occurred to me pretty early in that project that I should see if the Metropolitan couldn't have the same role that the Louvre had in Paris. And indeed, it turned out that it really could. So I started giving a tour called The Gay Secrets of the Metropolitan. And just about that time, someone at Harvard said, well, you know, you are a fairly prominent member of our gay alumni group. Why don't you see if you could do one of the MFA for the gay alumni group? And I immediately thought, yeah, that would really work. Now, I guess I can move on to a question, which is why the MFA in particular. It isn't actually true. I should say same-sex issues are quite prominent in the cultural production of a number of cultures and artistic periods, but it isn't true that every museum is rich in what we could call LGBT-themed pieces. Just as an example, the Philadelphia Museum is pretty weak. Who knows why? But why the MFA? Well, we'll be talking about that actually during my lecture to some extent because, well, on the whole, a museum that has a good Greek and Roman collection is often a good museum to do an LGBT-themed tour in, for reasons I think we're all aware of, and I'll talk about a little more later. But that's even truer of the Boston Museum because there was a famous gay collector at the very end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, who bought erotica in particular and gave them in particular to the Boston Museum because he wanted to send Bostonians a message. Just what message, I'm not sure. But anyway, so that was true. And I also think it may be important that the Boston Museum has quite a relationship with John Singer Sargent. That's sort of a different end of its artistic life, but since the two men knew each other, the two things are somewhat related. But other than that, you have to think it's somewhat random, the fact that the Boston Museum just has a lot of interesting pieces connected to various aspects of LGBT history. Probably the collectors or the curators who bought them didn't realize that the things had those connections. And so it's somewhat of a random thing. The Metropolitan and the MFA are both very rich in LGBT-themed things, so well, lucky for us. What else can I say? All right, I'm actually going to go backwards. Oh yes, we left that out. Okay, don't need to worry about that. Okay, so I'm going to start actually by talking about the very collector I just mentioned. Oh, actually let me pause for a moment and answer one more question. So today somebody asked me, how I can give a talk about LGBT art in an art museum and start with things from ancient Greece when, as many thinkers have pointed out, it's really hard to use terms like LGBT when talking about earlier historical periods or other cultures where people may not have had a sense of themselves as having a specific identity, a sexual identity built around an orientation towards sex objects of one gender or another. And yeah, I will take account of that when I talk about the individual pieces and the individual periods. But I think I have a simple way to answer that question, which is it is true that it's hard to use terms like LGBT in talking about people in Tahiti or people in ancient Greece. But for gay people in today's world, we have an identity built around same-sex relations, and therefore the history of same-sex relations is in some notional way the history of gay people. Right? It's of particular interest to gay people. So that's the sense in which we call it gay history, and so that's really the only sense in which I would use the term here. We are talking about phenomena in other cultures that speak to the phenomena in our culture. And I should say, actually, that I'm not going to talk in this lecture about the MFA does have a number of artists in modern periods who are gay. David Hockney, or perhaps quite a number who are what we would call bisexual. So we have Frida Kahlo or Georgia O'Keeffe. And I'm actually not going to talk about most of them tonight, merely because the specific works of theirs that are represented in the MFA don't have gay themes. So they aren't particularly interested. I will end with one work from a modern period by a gay artist about gay themes, which is by Paul Cadmus. But otherwise, I'll be talking about sort of a deeper history of same-sex love in the world. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to talking about these two men, the left-hand one of whom, Edward Perry Warren, is the collector that I was talking about earlier, usually known as Ned Warren. Ned Warren was the son of a very wealthy Bostonian family. His parents were people who competed with Jack Gardner to buy things like Titians. And he was gay, but he didn't really see himself. He was born in 1860, therefore somewhat before the modern idea of homosexuality, and he didn't really see himself through a lens of modern theories about sexuality. Instead, he saw himself through the lens of ancient Greek culture. And he wrote, actually, a 3-volume book about his view of sexuality. The book was called A Defense of Uranian Love. And I'm not recommending it. In fact, I do sort of remember where my copy is, which is at the university I used to teach at, the top shelf of a graduate student office. It's really tedious, but it's nonetheless interesting, obviously. And what he thought was that we should go back to having relationships like the ancient Greeks. And he bought an enormous, he also spent a large part of his gigantic fortune on buying ancient Greek art. His brother was the head of the trustees of the MFA, and so it was pretty easy for him to donate things to the MFA, and he gave a lot of these pieces to the museum. And as a result, as I was saying, the MFA has a simply astonishingly rich collection of ancient erotic pieces from Rome and also from Greece. And so I think before I go on to the next piece, maybe I'll switch to the picture. This is actually a piece donated by Warren. I think maybe I'd better say a few words about ancient Greek sexuality. So the ancient Greeks saw sexuality very differently from modern people. They certainly didn't have the idea that people could be divided into categories according to the sex they desired more. That was, and there are occasional hints that somebody might have that idea in Greek culture, but it certainly wasn't a common idea. Instead, their general idea about sexuality, by which I mean the sexuality of men, because that's the only sexuality they discuss, their general idea seems to be that men desire relations with women and adolescent boys. So equally, perhaps, or both. They don't tell us, sociologically speaking, about what's going on. But those are the kinds of relationships that they consider, I guess the word would be cool. Yeah, that's really just, they didn't have sin. It wasn't, it wasn't a Christian culture. So things were really divided into what it was, chic to do and what it was ridiculous to do. And it really doesn't match. You can't match it up against modern concepts because they divide sexuality up completely differently. So that a man is doing cool things if he's having relations with adolescent boys or women, frequently with women who are various forms of prostitute, although sometimes very fancy prostitutes, speaking of my Shady Ladies tours. And then things which are not cool include relations between adult men and also adultery. Those are bad. And are characteristic of the same kind of man who is effeminate. So don't try. just don't try to match it up against modern concepts. It really doesn't work. So the thing which we're going to talk about, because it's what appears in art, is these relationships that they approved of between adult men and adolescent boys. Now, I think probably the best, these relations were supposed, at least notionally, we can't judge whether this is true or not, but they were supposed to revolve around some kind of mentoring and role modeling relationship. So as my students at Pomona College, where I spent most of my career, used to call it tutoring with benefits. It's a good school. In that one line, you can see they were clever kids. So yes, that was these relations were supposed to revolve around, and these relations are very common in Greek, commonly referred to in Greek literature, in Greek art. If you took, everyone takes something about Greek literature at some point in their education. If they didn't say anything about this, your teacher or school had carefully removed it because it's everywhere. And it's also the tone that sets many things in Greek culture, such as the nude sculptures of adolescent athletes that we look at in art museums, really that's the context of all of those things, which we strive to ignore frequently in our culture, because these are relations, of course, of which we wouldn't approve. Right? So, as I was saying, they appear a lot in art, and particularly, they appear in this genre. So we're talking about the first object I'm going to talk to you about. This is what we call a vase. Scholars always call these vases. Yes, never vases, always vases. But the reason we call them vases is actually somewhat obscure, because they're not vases in the English sense of the word. Instead, that's just the Latin word vas, which means ceramic vessel, and we're just throwing it around in English, because that's the kind of thing scholars do. So this vase is actually an oil flask, and it has 3 scenes on it. And the top scene is a pretty typical courtship scene between an adult man and an adolescent boy. And you can see, I don't know how well you can see the beard. Oh no. I think I have a pointer. Oh yes. Does that look like a beard? It's kind of pointed. Anyway, that's a bearded man. And he's also thicker. You can see that he's bigger than the rather skinny boy in front of him. And he's courting him in a way that is traditional in art, presumably not in life, where he's reaching down with one hand. I don't think I need to explain where that hand is going. It's fairly obvious. And he's reaching up with the other hand and touching the boy's chin. This is actually something I've written a lot about, and I think it's just a symbolic combination of gestures. The touching someone's chin in Greek culture is a gesture of begging. It's supplication. And so it's a combination of supplication and lust, is what's being portrayed. And this is one of the commonest kinds of courtship scenes, I should say. So there are about 50,000 Greek vases in museums in the world today, and about 1,000 of them have male-male courtship scenes on them, and about 10,000, a full 20%, have little inscriptions about these relationships, which I'll tell you about in a minute. So it's really a very big theme. What you also see, another very common form of courtship, is that you give the boy gifts. And you can see the gifts. They're being held by a kind of series of retainers behind the man. He has a fighting cock over here, and over here he has a hare, H-A-R-E, hare. And of course the man is accompanied by a hunting dog. Oops, I don't seem to be able to, oh, there it is. It's got a hunting dog. So the middle register is just youths riding horses, which is a fashionable thing to do in ancient Greece. Greece is not a rich country with lots of plains. So if you have enough money to own a little bit of horse country, you have to be pretty rich in Greece, today as well, I should think. But in the lowest register, you see a cockfight and a hunting scene with a hunting dog chasing a hare and a throw stick hitting the unfortunate hare in the head. And I think that this lower scene shows you what the gifts in the upper scene are for. It's pretty clear. You have a fighting cock to have cockfights, and you give a boy a hare so that he will hunt the hare with a dog like your dog. In other words, he'll learn to be a hunter like you. So I would say that in a not too distant symbolic way, this vase shows the tutoring with benefits system. Boys are supposed to learn male activities and male virtues from their lover. So the museum has lots and lots of art on this theme, and I'll switch to another one. One thing that people often ask me is what they did to consummate these relations. And we really don't see it very much. The Greeks don't talk a lot about consummated sex in these relations because they're extremely prudish. These are relations that are supposed to be very respectable, and so they don't talk about it. And in literature, they do say occasionally that you want a boy to gratify you. No further details are given. You just hope that he'll gratify you. Who knows what that means? Now, the reason that becomes such a question is that there are lots of sexual activities we know they didn't approve of. So we know that they didn't approve of anal sex because that's only something that ridiculous people do. It comes up a lot when you're talking ill about prostitutes, or there are satyrs, which you may know are these kind of half-goat men. They do things like that. Okay, so no anal sex, at least notionally. Oral sex is always treated as very low in Greek literature. It's just disgusting. And masturbation also does not seem to be an option. Because, yes, you see the difficulty, don't you? The only time we see masturbation or hear about masturbation in Greek, it's slaves engaging in it. And I suppose that's because they don't have any other options. So what did they do? Well, there are about 35 scenes on vases which show us intercourse of a kind. And this is a scene in which you can see, so this is a winged god. It's a fragment, obviously, sorry, it's not very easy to read. So you have a winged god here. I think he's Zephyrus, the god of the west wind. And he has a boy. You can tell he's a boy because he's holding a lyre, and that's part of boys' education. So you're learning to sing poetry to the lyre. He's holding the boy up against him, front to front, right? Because their feet are facing this way. And you can actually see his erect penis pushing kind of through the boy's clothing. That part may not be very realistic, but then winged gods are not very realistic anyway. So I don't think you need to worry too much about whether it's realistic. Anyway, this is how they seem to at least want us to think they had sex, which is something we used to, in America, call the Princeton rub. At least that's what it was called at Harvard. Yeah. Perhaps enough said. So, just a few more things about Greek sexuality, because the MFA has such a fun collection of stuff about Greek sexuality. And so I'll just show you a few more things before we go on to other cultures. This is a kind of Greek divine statue at which you worship. It's called a Herm. It's the god Hermes. But it's a very primitive kind of statue. It's just a stone statue with a bearded head on it, and then a phallus. And these are kind of boundary markers. I think the phallus is supposed to warn you off. And you can see, by the way, that it's being worshipped because there's a wreath hanging from it. Now, this doesn't have anything particular to do with same-sex relations. It just has to do with the Greeks having a very different view of male genitalia from us, I hope. But what you can see is there are also letters on the side. And these letters say the words, I've written it up above here for you, glaukon kalos, which means glaukon is beautiful. And this is actually very typical of Greek culture. Greeks went around writing so-and-so is beautiful all the way around the city. We hear about them, and we actually still have a few archaeological examples of them. As I said, there are about 10,000 of these on vases. So they're extremely common. And glaukon is the second most popular object of these inscriptions. So he must have been one hell of a cute guy, which we hope. All right, and then I think this is my last Greek slide. Yeah, oops. So I just thought I would finish with this little slide. This is also a fragment of a vase, actually of a pitcher. And you can see very clearly that it represents a pair of guys involved in some kind of battle. There's a bearded guy at the back holding a sword, and then a not bearded guy in front of him holding a sword up over his head. Now, any ancient person in Greek or Roman culture would recognize them immediately, because these are among the most famous visual images in Greek culture. These are the Toranasides of Athens. They are the couple, clearly to a Greek mind portrayed as such, bearded man, beardless youth, and all our historical sources tell us they were a couple, who assassinated the brother of the tyrant in 513 BC and led to the foundation of the Athenian democracy. So they were enormous objects of cultural adulation in Athens and also in the Roman Empire. They were the first subjects of a statue of a mortal human in Athenian history. And they were also worshipped as semi-divine with blood sacrifice at their grave. They were really enormously important. They are mentioned in both of the first histories in the world, Thucydides and Herodotus. They're really very, very adulated. And so I think they really show the different status of same-sex relations in Greek culture to the modern world, where this is, in effect, this is the Athenian version of Uncle Sam. Right. As I think I said on my tour this evening, Uncle Sam and Robin. So before we have lots of things to cover this evening, and I just thought I would point out that it isn't much of sex history, say as written by Foucault, is about the contrast between ancient Greece and the modern world. These are two very different cultures, and so they show that sexuality can be lived very differently in different cultures. But there are lots of different cultures that had different ideas of sexuality. It isn't only Greece versus the modern world. And one of the cultures that people seem thoroughly unaware of is Japan. Japan of the historic period that lasts from the foundations of Japan around, in the 11th or 12th century up to the mid-19th century, when, as a part of the industrialization and westernization campaign of the 19th century, the government very intentionally wiped away traditional Japanese ideas about sexuality. And it was really very much more like ancient Greece than like the modern world. The big object of attraction in ancient Greece is the beautiful youth. The word for which is wakashu, which I've written up there. And this is an image of a wakashu. And it's quite typical of Japanese culture that you can tell who someone is by specific details about their dress or hairdo. It's all very hierarchical. So before they go through their coming of age ceremony, boys shaved their pate and then wore long locks brushed over it. And you can always see the shaved pate, which is that white area in the middle of his head, and then the locks worn from his forehead back over his head. Now, there were differences between the Japanese view of the beautiful youth and the Greek one. Among other things, they're seen as sex objects both for men and women. And also sex is anal, always, when with men. They don't really seem to think of anything else. But it's a very common vision of the beautiful boy. And this one is holding a hand drum, which is a very typical thing for a boy to hold, because you can dance with a hand drum, and it's kind of sexy. And I just thought I'd show you one more image. This is from, Japan, I guess Japanese ideas of sexuality, first of all, are better documented than ancient Greek ones. It's a relatively recent period. The printing press already existed. We have lots and lots of evidence. It's just that scholars don't work on it. So that's the only reason we don't know too much about it. In ancient Greece, there's no way in which a relationship between adult men could be okay. And saying a man is effeminate is inevitably a way of saying he's really bad. But in Japan, things were a little more varied. So actors from the kabuki theater played women's roles, just as male actors did in the Elizabethan period in the English-speaking world. And they were very frequently also prostitutes. And it seemed to be okay to have sex with them as well. So wakashu, or also onagata, which are sort of cross-dressed male prostitutes. And so this is an image of a kabuki, and these kinds of relations, but the relations with the boys, particularly samurai and their pages, are often very idealized in a kind of Greek way, and they're full of heroic detail. And they're often the subjects of kind of glorious heroic stories in Japanese culture. And this is one of those. It's a kabuki play about a relationship between a samurai, whom you can see crouched, and a wakashu, who is up here. Now, in this case, it's just even more complicated, because this is from a time period where young male actors were no longer allowed on the Japanese stage because they got too many fans and people were fighting over them. And so this is an adult man playing the role of being a wakashu. So you can see, oops, I'm not very good with this. You can see he has the shaved pate and long locks, but in fact, he's not a boy. In any case, the play is about the romance between this samurai and a wakashu, and then the samurai ends up dying, I think, in order to defend something which belonged to the boy's family. But dying on behalf of the lover is a gigantic theme in Japanese culture, as it was in Greek culture. Those of you who know the Iliad will know the big example of that, where Achilles goes out to fight on behalf of his dead lover. So, now, nothing we've talked about so far has included anything about female-female relations, and in fact, female-female relations are substantially less well documented throughout world history. This is, of course, for the obvious reason, which is that the life of women is much less well documented. So, nothing surprising, particularly about something that involves two women and no men being less well documented. But of course, from ancient Greece, we have Sappho, one poet who writes about female-female relations, or sings about female-female relations. And there's a little bit of evidence also from Roman culture. I can't tell you too much about it in Japanese and Chinese culture because there's very little scholarship on it. And so it's not my area, and there's nothing to read about it. But they were not as, it's more common in art than it is in Japanese and Chinese culture. This is a, excuse me, that it is in Greek or Roman culture. This is a Chinese painting that's here at the MFA. It's not on display. And the Japanese things, by the way, are also not on display that I've showed you this evening. And this is a, I don't know what the poem says because there's no translation of it. But it's a series of scenes of women in the pleasure garden of a house. I believe the poem is about what women get up to when the menfolk are away. And I think it's meant as humorous. But there are, I think we can see here that there's a woman with, I don't know how well you can see, but her legs are apart and there's something sexual going on and the other woman is pleasuring her with some object. And I know that in one of the other scenes in this series, they're buying a dildo from a passing salesman. But this doesn't seem to be the dildo. She's using something else in this scene. It's a very, I mean, it is a pretty funny series, actually. So one of the other things I'm trying to get through the whole LGBT thing. I mean, B is everywhere, and G as distinct from B, we'll get to at the end. And we've just managed to dip into L for a moment, but something that's actually pretty rare in art museums is the T aspect of the spectrum. Now, but there are, of course, cultures outside the West where there are more than two genders. And the MFA actually has, although I'm not showing it to you this evening, a lovely woven water jar called an ola from Zuni Native American piece, which is by a weaver who was a man-woman, as they would say. That was the currently popular term. People used to say a two-spirited person, which is common among many Native American groups and also in the South Pacific. And this is a work by, well, probably one of the most famous works at the MFA, right? So it's Paul Gauguin's last canvas, his vast canvas that resumes his philosophical view, which is a kind of combination of Christian and Tahitian ideas. He was living in Tahiti and dying of syphilis. Yes, I'm just trying, that little detail was an attempt to make Gauguin seem a little less grand and respectable. I know we all imagine that artists from the past are you know, they had a beard, so they must be like Zeus. But actually, Gauguin was a pretty shabby character in many ways. I think one of the characteristics of Tahitian society is just like Hawaii, that there are Hawaiian traditional society, they also have a third gender. It's very much like Native Americans. They're people who are born male but live as women. In Hawaii, they're called mahu, and in Tahiti, they're called mauhi. And among his many sexual interests, Gauguin was really fascinated by them. I don't know that he had any kinds of relationships with them, but he might have. He puts them in his work a lot. And I think that what interests me about this painting is very simply that people walk by it and don't notice that there's a pretty clear man-woman right in the middle. Because the whole thing is about, it's a sort of life cycle. It goes from a baby all the way to an old woman who's reflecting on her life. And everyone is a woman. And then in the middle, you have this figure who's reaching for this is a Christianized motif, it's actually quite common in Gauguin, of someone reaching for the fruit of the tree of knowledge. So it's therefore Eve, but not physically female. And don't know that I need to comment anymore. It's perfectly clear in terms of Tahitian culture what it is. And Gauguin writes in his writings about how, erotically excited he is as well. So, and somebody pointed out to me today, I think it's true, that this figure in the back is also plausibly a Mahu as well. It's a woman, but it has a kind of big chin and not very female facial structure. So that I'm just pointing out because I bet you didn't notice him before, him or her. So we scoot on. We're going on into the, I guess what to a classicist, I call this the modern West, but perhaps to people who don't think of the Renaissance as modern times. Anyway, much more modern than the things I study. The Renaissance is a period whose homoeroticism people ignore to some extent. But the Italian Renaissance was as much a period of revival of sexual customs as it was a period of revival of other aspects of Greek and Roman culture. And not in every sense, Renaissance people revived the courtesan, a kind of high-class prostitute, independent prostitute, which was a big feature of Greek society and didn't exist either in Roman society or in the Middle Ages, and suddenly comes back into existence in the Renaissance. And there's also a great deal of Greek-style man-boy stuff going on in Renaissance Italy. I think Renaissance Italy is actually the key to understanding the history of sexuality for us, because although there is no scholarship about it, I also think it's the first place in the history of the West where we have people who are thought of as having sexual identities. This is really something nobody works on at all, since people mostly date that to the 18th century because they ignore Italy and perhaps even its existence. But homoeroticism is very important in the art, particularly of Florence in the Renaissance. One of the many things that was revived was the nude sculpture, which Donatello revived for his nude David, who's portrayed as an extremely sexy boy, smirking at the audience while the feather from Goliath's helmet caresses his inner thigh. The homoeroticism is really overwhelming in the art of the period, and this also extends to pictures of the nude Jesus. I know, I hope you're not going to be shocked. Should I have given you a trigger warning? Perhaps not this audience. Religious imagery is often very sexual in the Renaissance. I think, it's a chance to paint a nude, which they didn't have too many of. It's either mythology or religion are the two chances. And there are a number of quite sexy Jesuses. It's really a big theme, but this is probably the high point of them and just happens to be at the Museum of Fine Arts. It's work by Rosso Fiorentino. It is true that we're told that Rosso was the lover of his master, who's Pontormo. These are also kind of Michelangelo-esque painters, what we now call Mannerists. But I don't know that that's particularly relevant to the fact that he simply eroticized the dead Christ in an almost incredible way. If this guy has rigor mortis, well, then I don't know what rigor mortis looks like. He's lounging in a curvy way in the arms of his dishy angel friends with a particularly ecstatic look on his face, which I suppose is the coming ascension being symbolized, perhaps. But it's a kind of sexual version. The way he's crossing his thighs also sexualizes him, it seems to me. He's a very rare Christ in that he has pubic hair. But because of the way he's crossing his thighs, it's gender ambiguous. It's not really clear what sex he is. And then, of course, the angels are holding possibly the most phallic symbols in the world on either side of him. It's a really racy picture. So I know it's perhaps somewhat blasphemous, but it's really common in Renaissance art, these sexy Jesuses. And I think it's just the exuberant culture of homoeroticism of the Renaissance slopping over into religious imagery. So we move on, because we only have a few more minutes. We're into the 18th century, where this is a work that I just found recently at the MFA. It's on loan to the museum, and it belonged to one of the sort of original famous gay people, really. And we are in the 18th century, and I think we can use the term. This man is named William Beckford. I find that people have not heard of Beckford very much, which is a pity because he was quite a character. He was one of the first Gothic novelists. He designed one of the early neo-Gothic houses, his own, because he was also fabulously wealthy. He was a piano student of Mozart's. He was probably the greatest art collector, one of the couple in English history, certainly the only non-royal one who reached at that level. Many, many artworks in museums like the Metropolitan come from Beckford's collections. There was a big sex scandal about Beckford in the 1780s, where we don't really know what happened, but it seems he was found in a locked bedroom horsewhipping his boyfriend, a boy named William Kitty Courtney, the 9th Earl of Pembroke, who had perhaps let his love letters get into the hands of the Lord Chief Justice, who was the young Earl's stepfather. Anyway, the interesting thing about Beckford is not really the sex scandal, but rather that I think he serves as a role model very much for Byron, who was obsessed by him, as Byron did for Wilde, and that he really is the beginnings of the merger of the dandy and the homosexual, which kind of fuses with Oscar Wilde. And also, he's one of the very first people, I think, that I know of in history who thinks of himself as we would think of as having something in common with other people who have relations with other males. Because we have his scrapbooks in which he keeps all of the clippings about the trials where guys are arrested for sodomy. And he comments sympathetically in the margins. It's fascinating. It's a completely novel in the 18th century. So yeah, he's quite an interesting historical figure. So we move on. We're back to a very rare lesbian moment at the MFA. I know this is a naked man, sorry. it's not lesbian in its theme, but it is by a lesbian artist from Massachusetts. This is by a woman named Harriet Hosmer, who was from Watertown, by the way. So she is the most famous person from Watertown ever. So I know that's not a very big category, yeah, but she was a member of a circle of lesbian, we would call them lesbians, women who lived in what were then called Boston marriages, among American artist women in Rome of the 1850s. These women are the subject of Hawthorne's novel, The Marble Faun. And, you know, let's not forget that Hawthorne was also something very close to Melville's boyfriend, so there's not, you know, let's not let the past seem straighter than it is, because this is not a very straight group of people. And anyway, I think probably the most famous thing from this group of people is the statue of the angel of the fountain in Central Park, the angel of the waters on the Bethesda fountain, which then kind of shows up in Angels in America, so it sort of comes into gay history again. But that's by a woman named Emma Stebbins, who was also one of these lady artists in Rome. And anyway, this sculpture really just shows, it's more about Hosmer's feminism. She was the first woman who insisted on, she was first of all the first successful female sculptor in America, and she also insisted on being able to do nude males, which after all women were not allowed to do. They couldn't go to the studios. And she really insisted on it. And every time you read about her, people mention it. So it must have been considered quite shocking at the time. So we're moving on very rapidly, just 3 things to the end. I just thought I would ask you the same question I asked people on my tour this afternoon. This is one of John Singer Sargent's murals, well, they're actually oil, from the MFA. It represents romantic versus classical art, and they're being judged by Apollo. And I just think the way to introduce this subject is to ask you, how many models Sargent had? Look at the faces. How many different faces do you see? Romantic art, classical art, 2 people or 1 person? I hear somebody say 1. Yes. It is definitely 1. And this is because Sargent, I think, had what we would call an obsession. Yes, he did. So Sargent is a very interesting person in the history of sexuality. We know nothing about his sexuality. Nothing. He was the ultimate buttoned-up person. There are a couple of rumors, very, very, very little comes through. In this, he is the perfect Edwardian gentleman. But I think he can, in some sense, represent the closet It's not really clear what was in the closet, but it was certainly very closeted. And there are a number of reasons why scholars for quite a while now have thought that he was probably more interested in men than women. And this has a lot to do with the artworks which he kept for his own view. As opposed to his public artworks, he had a sketchbook of charcoals, which includes a lot of quite eroticized nude males, particularly pictures of his valet, which I regard as quite erotic. And then there's another work, which the MFA bought under the curator, who actually probably was the first person to voice this theory about Sargent, Trevor Fairbrother. And this is the work. It's a nude male, obviously, portrait of an Afro-American bellhop that Sargent met at the Copley Plaza Hotel in 1916, and who was the model for an enormous percentage of Sargent's big mural projects in Boston. Yeah, the painting is, I think, and I don't have too much time, and going on about this painting would take a long time. It's a very tense painting. The posture of the sitter is extremely tense. And this, I think, is typical of Sargent when he's doing his most complicated work. The famous portrait that he called Madame X is also in an extremely tense, strange posture. And I think it speaks to the many ambiguities of the painting. This is a black man whom he used as a model for white figures. He's somewhere between, he's like an angel in that he's got this kind of wing-like background behind him, which are actually the wings of a gigantic raptor, which Sargent set him in front of, but at the same time, somewhat sexy. It's a very ambiguous picture, and quite interesting that Sargent kept it for himself. And this, I think, fits in a series of 19th century artists. Melville also never published Billy Budd. That was found among his papers when he died. And I think this is what a gentleman did with his homoerotic work. He just kept it for himself. And so I'm going to end coming out of the closet. Yes, so Sargent represents the closet. Here's one of probably the first American artists who came out of the closet. You won't recognize this work because it's not on display at the MFA, but it is in the collection. This is Paul Cadmus. He was a painter who was famous for the gay themes in his work from the very beginning of his career. And this is actually a trio painting of three gay guys who were in a kind of ménage à trois. And the most famous of them today, I think, is the one who is lounging in the semi-nude, who is the photographer George Platt Lynes. And the other two are both boyfriends of his. The author Glenway Westcott, who's wearing some kind of weird black silk house thing that he had perhaps designed himself, and then the pseudo-sailor, which is Monroe Wheeler, who was a curator at the Museum of Modern Art. Yeah, I don't think the qualities of the painting are really germane, so I'm not going to talk about them. But it really represents a very different period in gay history from John Singer Sargent, although it's not that distant in time. Right? The distance in time is about 20 years between the two paintings. But we've come into a world which was described in the book published this year called The Home Intern, which was a period in which fairly openly gay figures, at least people whose homosexuality was an open secret, were extremely important in the cultural world, and their relationships with each other were important. And this painting is really from that period, an early aspect of that period. So anyway, just give you a little walkthrough of some gay history works at the MFA. I hope it makes your time at the museum more interesting in the future. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. If people have any questions, there's a microphone on either side. If you want to just raise your hand.
Have I intimidated you all?
I just wondered what, if anything, you made of that bronze statue called the Dock Hand in Gallery 251.
I can't hear, sorry.
I was wondering if you'd come across that bronze statue called the Dock Hand in Gallery 251 upstairs.
No, I haven't. Now I will.
Excellent.
Sorry, okay. Can you raise your hand, whoever had the question?
There's someone down here.
Okay.
Yes, right. I can hear you. They can't.
You know, you intimated on the tour that Van Gogh was in love with Gauguin, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that's an extremely obscure topic. But Gauguin really lived in a world of young men adulating him. And the relationships are often semi-erotic. And yeah, I think there's fair amount of reason in reading Van Gogh's letters to Gauguin to see them as pretty eroticized. Gauguin was not a very nice person or a warm person, and I don't think he necessarily reciprocated, but he thrived on it, and perhaps even abused it a little bit, because he really, he used the money in Van Gogh's family to support himself. You think of Van Gogh as very poor, right? But that's because he was being supported by his brother, and so was Gauguin. Yeah.
Thank you. I was very much intrigued by your comments about Renaissance Florence, which obviously must have been a terribly exciting time to live. I have heard very interesting comments about some of the artwork, like some of the absolutely beautiful Botticelli angels, and that in a way they were almost deliberately seductive to lure you in and convince you to be virtuous. In other words, basically it was like Abercrombie boys in a Weber photograph luring you to buy a product. Here it was trying to sell a ideal life because you were going to be lured in first by the angels and then see maybe a religious scene in the background. Would you like to?
Yeah, I think that is one of the possible meanings of those angels, but I think it's dancing on a very thin line, and I think that what seems to be the implications changes a lot from artist to artist and painting to painting. So that in Rosso Fiorentino, it's a little hard to imagine that that's meant to lure you into religion. I don't see how the seemingly orgasmic Christ would lure you into being more religious. But I think that is a good argument maybe about Botticelli. Yeah.
Thank you.
There's a question way in the back.
Thanks for the lecture. So my question will be related to class, which is something that we haven't touched on, and I think that is very much related to, sex. So, so just really briefly, in all the pieces that we've talked about, to what extent is erotica kind of an object in the eyes of those who held power, or to what extent did it exist amongst elites, amongst, yeah.
Yeah, I think that until the existence of photography, erotica belonged to the elite, and exclusively to the elite. It must have been a terrible life for poor people. There was no porn, which is certainly very unlike the world today. But yeah, absolutely, the way you got to have a sexy picture was by being the king of Spain. And then you could commission Titian to make a painting which was Venus and also happened to be modeled on a courtesan with whom you'd spent a week in Venice. And then you put it in a special room in the Prado behind a curtain, and you only opened it so you could see it when your friend the Duke of Alba and you had a little spare time. I know, it's hard to imagine. But otherwise, I think even from the wealthy merchant class down, there was nothing erotic to look at. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are also obviously interesting class issues about the erotic object in paintings. So that in ancient Greece, it's all notionally elite with elite. But certainly in things like Sargent's Thomas E. McKellar or many 19th century pictures, the distance between lover and love object is elite to non-elite. Yeah. Absolutely. No, not at all.
So today when we're looking in the Botticelli exhibit, she was commenting on the fact that there was a painting that included John the Baptist, who looked like a woman. Having gone around the Louvre looking for Da Vinci's paintings in the Louvre, I've seen a few other things of John the Baptist who looked like a woman.
Right. So just like the dead Jesus, certain things in religion become eroticized to the point that you take it for granted later on. So people talk now about Saint Sebastian as this gay symbol. And I just read a list actually somewhere in The Advocate, that great scholarly source, about 20 saints who were gay. And half of them were saints who didn't even really exist, let alone have a sexuality. But one of them was Saint Sebastian. And so, Saint Sebastian was a Roman soldier. And we know anything about him as an individual if this story actually occurred in any way, shape, or manner. But he has become a symbol of homoeroticism through the way he was used in art. And the reason he was used that way in art, as far as I can see, is simply that he was killed when naked. Therefore, he could be portrayed erotically. And so from the Renaissance on, he became very erotic, just like the dead Christ. Similarly, John the Baptist is young. And in a society where the general view of the idea of same-sex love is adult, adolescent, which is certainly still true in the Italian Renaissance, he's young and somewhat naked. And so he's very eroticized, frequently. The most erotic one is a Caravaggio, unsurprisingly, frequently an erotic painter. But there's one in the Musei Capitolini in Rome where John the Baptist has his arms around a ram with this big ram's head, and he's kind of snuggling. It's just, it really could have been in Blue Boy. It's just ridiculous. But yeah, so John the Baptist is another one, absolutely. And certainly the Leonardo da Vinci, John the Baptist is modeled on his favorite assistant, a boy he refers to as Salai, which means kind of like little devil, who stayed with him just about his whole life and was somebody with whom he certainly had an extremely sexualized relationship, and to whom, by the way, he left both that painting and the Mona Lisa. Yeah, so he's a big figure in Leonardo's life. More? No?
Great. Thank you so much for coming today, and thank you to Andrew.